Today, Christy Gates from Scriptural Engagement is going to be helping me facilitate. She's going to be running the PowerPoint, the Zoom, sorry. And then she will also manage the breakout rooms and the helping me facilitate kind of the debrief from the breakouts. We will have a time for questions at the end, so please write down your questions as we go, and you'll have time to ask them. We will have some breakout chats where you will meet with a small group online and have some interaction around the topics we discuss. Each small group should designate someone as the reporter, and when the breakout rooms come back, when the small groups come back to the main session, each reporter can give a brief summary, one sentence only, it's all we need, through the private chat to Christy, and then Christy will summarize them to us. So as we just said, the main session is being recorded, but not the breakout sessions. So if you're watching this as a recording, you may want to have your journal or some paper to do the exercises as we go along. Now this session, the last time we timed it was about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I realize this is advertised as an hour and we already have a little bit of a late start. So if at the top of the hour you feel like you need to go, feel free. And then you can watch the rest of the webinar online, the rest of the recording, that is. All right, so everyone in the group chat, if you could introduce yourself. So give your name, your role in or out of IV, and the location where you serve from. And 1, 2, 3, go.
I'll go first.
Sonalia, we're doing it on the, actually, you know what, we don't have a lot of people, so yeah, you could probably.
Oh, in the group chat, got it. Did you want to join group chat?
You know what, in the interest of time, yeah, let's do that.
Cool.
Just put your introduction in the group chat. I'm gonna get us started. So really the main thrust of what I'm hoping to do today is to share with you a spiritually healthy response to anxiety. This is going to be a multidisciplinary approach where I use both psychology and spiritual formation. And like any multidisciplinary approach, what we want to do is look for synergies between the two, as well as tensions. And as you'll see from most of what I share, I'm really focusing on the synergies. My background is actually in both. So I have a spiritual direction certificate from North Park Seminary. I've studied my Doctor of Ministry work at Tyndale, specifically in spiritual formation. And I am a psychotherapist, and my master's in counseling is from Northeastern Illinois. So first of all, it's important for us to keep our perspective. We're here to pastor, not to be mental health professionals. We want to give a spiritually healthy response. And that includes avoiding things that are unhelpful, and then emphasizing the spiritual responses that support mental health. And then finally, we want to be able to refer students to mental health professionals when necessary. And that is a question I get a lot whenever I'm asked to put on something like this or to write an article or something. And so I'm going to start with that, and let's get that question out of the way. When do we know how to refer students? Well, first of all, there isn't any like hard and fast rule that says that, you know, when these things are ticked off, then the person should be referred. Anybody can choose to go see a counselor if at any time they feel like their level of distress that justifies it, and they probably can do fruitful work. However, on the other hand, if we want to look at like some rules of thumb, typically if somebody's daily activities are being interfered with, so if the anxiety interferes with daily activities like sleeping, eating, concentrating enough to study or to teach or what have you, those are really good indicators that referring to somebody to a mental health professional is a good idea. Another good indicator is if the anxious thoughts are very intrusive, if they keep distracting the person and they can't shake them. And then finally, if the anxiety extends to multiple areas of life, that's a pretty good indicator that maybe something is going on that could use some professional help. So I want to talk a little bit about the basics of what do therapists do with anxiety. And there's three or four general groupings of therapies that I'm going to focus on. The first one is desensitization and exposure therapies. And they fall into three groups. All three of them basically follow the same theme of overcoming the anxiety by actually facing it. Whether we do it slowly, whether we do it quickly, you'll see as I describe each of those. So the first one of these is exposure and response prevention. If you think about, for example, somebody who has a hard time leaving their house without checking that they locked the door 10 times, or even they check it 3 times and halfway to the car, they start to get anxious. Did I lock my door? And then they go back to the door and check it again. So that in itself is a kind of anxiety loop that is interrupted if they prevent themselves from going back and checking that the door is locked. So stopping the excessive checking is a way to do what is called exposure and response prevention. So the exposure is they're exposing themselves to the anxiety by actually locking the door. They're not avoiding it, say, by having their spouse be the one to lock the door. Because for a lot of people, that's what they do, right? They'll avoid it, they'll have their spouse take care of it, and then they don't have to deal with it. But that doesn't help the anxiety get better. What would help the anxiety to get better is if they actually expose themselves to locking the door, which is an anxiety-producing thing for them, and then they prevent themselves from checking it. So stopping that excessive checking is what exposure and response prevention is about. Stopping continual reassurance seeking, it falls in the same category. It doesn't have to be obsessive compulsive disorder, as many of the people who go through exposure and response prevention are dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder, but it doesn't have to be, right? Stopping continual reassurance seeking, for example, in my life, I'll give you a clear example. When the kids were young, I used to be really worried about their health. So if they sneezed, I thought they were going to get a cold and then they were going to get bronchitis. And the bronchitis, if they got a cough, then I thought that it is for sure bronchitis and it's going to turn into pneumonia. And if they had a bronchitis, I was sure it was going to turn into pneumonia. And I was like, if it wasn't for my much calmer wife, I'd be on my way to the emergency room. And so one of the ways that I used to deal with that, which was very helpful, was to rely on my wife's judgment. Sometimes when in areas of anxiety, it's good to rely on the judgment of somebody who is not dealing with anxiety, where things are not feeling distorted. And so I would rely on my wife and I'd say, honey, what do you think? Do we need to take them to the doctor? And she'd be like, no, they're fine. Okay. Now, if I stop there, that's great. But if an hour later I start to feel anxious again and I ask her again, I'm seeking reassurance from her again. It's like my checking the door again, right? It would be as if I were the person with the checking the door. If I keep myself from continually asking her, then I can find relief from the anxiety. If, on the other hand, I keep asking her, the more I ask, the more the anxiety is going to continue to grow. Of course, we see this today with people checking the news constantly, with people looking at their, at their apps to see, the spread of the virus and so on. The more they check, looking for reassurance to say, oh my gosh, has it abated yet? Has it abated yet? The more that's going to feed the anxiety. In social anxiety situations, you find maybe some of your students struggle with this. They post something and then they go back and see how many likes they got. Well, the more they go back to look how many likes they got, the more it feeds the anxiety, because it's telling their brain there's something to be anxious about. And so if they refrain from continual reassurance to go back and see, am I getting likes? Am I accepted? Am I loved, etc.? Then it will help them to overcome the anxiety. So once again, exposure response prevention. Systematic desensitization is a little bit different in that it's an actually planned program that is done usually with a therapist, although some people do it from workbooks and so on. Let's say somebody's afraid of an elevator or afraid of elevators in general, and they work on the 10th floor and it's interfering with their life to go up and down 10 floors on the stairs. So they want to face the anxiety. So they go see a therapist and the therapist says, okay, well, we're going to design a program of systematic desensitization where step number 1, the least anxiety producing thing for you is to just think about an elevator. And then step number 10 is going to be actually go up the 10 floors in the elevator. And then maybe in between, we'll do things like stand in front of the elevator and then stand in front of the elevator and push a button. Or then the next step is step in the elevator and back out, and then go up one floor with a friend. You get the idea. Usually that's done along with teaching people relaxation techniques, and the support of a therapist is usually helpful because it's very hard for people to face things that make them anxious. Another example is flooding. Now, flooding is pretty much the same idea in the long run as systematic desensitization, but it's like ripping the Band-Aid really fast rather than slowly. So you face the fear, you go from 1 to 10 right away. I'll give you an example of flooding again in my own life. I hate heights. I'm terrified of heights. So my church used to have the back to school camp out event at the end of every summer. And so the dads would take the kids camping at the same campground every year. And one year they had a new setup. They had climbing walls. And of course, the kids were really intrigued by these, 40-foot high climbing walls. And I did not want to model to the kids anxiety. I wanted to model actually facing the anxiety. So I decided, well, I'm going to do it. And so I talked to the guy running the pulleys and the belays and so on. And he reassured me that this thing can hold up an entire car and it can carry a lot of weight and so on. And of course, was I reassured? No way, right? The more I talked to him, the more scared I got. But regardless, I strapped in and I climbed the wall without looking down. My heart rate was through the roof. I could hear myself huffing and puffing, not because it was so hard, but just because, I was anxious. Anyway, I get to the top and I start rappelling back down and I'm like, oh, this thing is safe. This is fun. And I was no longer scared. And so the systematic the exposure therapies work really quickly. It's surprising how quickly they work. And even for the clients that I work with, they get surprised like, oh, wow, I did this. And you know what? After a few minutes, it was fine. I'm like, yeah. At first, the anxiety goes up, but we need to stay with it long enough for the anxiety to go down. And then once it goes down, it gets better. So the good thing is it doesn't just get better for the moment. It actually has some staying power. So after I came down from that wall, I went on and I climbed all the other walls, at least the ones that I could manage. Some of the ones that sloped back I couldn't do, but you get the idea, right? So that's flooding. Now, the opposite of desensitization is something that we need to pay attention to. Because that's avoidance, and avoidance can actually make anxiety worse. Sometimes it just stays at the same baseline, but it doesn't get better. Avoidance actually is something that we need to work actively against. And it's a little bit of how God kind of works with us sometimes, is that he helps us to face the fear, and I'll get into that a little bit later. All right, here's a few more anxiety treatments. Transforming traumatic experiences. For a lot of people, anxiety stems from a trauma. And most trauma therapies focus on some way of retelling the story, reliving the emotions of the trauma while receiving empathy and attunement. And, there's different kinds, different ways of approaching it, but the common denominator is usually the receiving empathy and an attunement by retelling and going through it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that from God's perspective a little bit later as well. Another important category that we're not going to invest a lot of time in is mindfulness-based therapies. I'll describe that a little bit later, but they require investment. They require some significant work, but they do work. And they make changes to the brain. I mean, almost all the treatments cause changes to the brain. We used to think that the brain was a fairly static organ, that it did not regenerate, it did not reform. Now we think of the brain more like a bodybuilder who can actually invest in their musculature, and they can grow certain muscles more than others by investing in certain exercises. And the same is true with our brain. And so mindfulness-based therapies, as they invest more intentionally in specific exercises, they're more intentional about changing the brain to become a little bit healthier. And, I have a whole thing about, mindfulness from a Christian perspective, which that's not what this webinar is about. But for now, we'll talk a little bit about people who are already using mindfulness and what we can offer just as a support. Finally, medication, we'll leave that to the people who are qualified. I'm not. I will leave it to the psychiatrists and the physicians involved. Just need to be aware that that's available, and that for the right people at the right time, that is an answer that we need to be supportive of. All right, so what are some do's and don'ts? What doesn't work and what does work? And to do that, we're going to do a quick exercise. I'm going to ask you to break into groups here very shortly. Christy's going to put everybody into groups of 3. And the question that I want you to answer together is, what is the best and worst advice you've been given in how to deal with anxiety? So each of the 3 of you will answer that question. What is the best and worst advice you've been given and how to deal with anxiety? And remember, you need to designate one person to report back a quick summary of the discussion. And the reporter, whoever you are, via private chat to Christy when you come back. And that's going to be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about your name being associated with it or anything like that. So, all right, take it away, Christy. How are we doing, Christy?
This is great. There's a theme coming out already.
All right.
Lots of best practices include naming what's true, like you're safe here. Here's what's true from scripture. Also breathing exercises, breathing out your anxious thoughts to Jesus.
Oh, that's a good one.
Just relax, grin, and bear it. Not good advice, but empathy, listening attentively, helpful. Not cool when people are like, just trust God, he's in control.
We're going to talk about that, actually.
Get over it. Cool. Go ahead, Nader.
All right. Okay. So, well, I think we've covered some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in the do's and don'ts, which is exactly on target. So one of the things that we want to avoid is to simply tell people not to worry and have faith. Faith is not something that they can dig deep and conjure up. It's not a matter of effort. It's not like they can white knuckle their way through it and get more faith that way. What is better is to suggest that they pray regularly for increased faith. Another thing to do would be to go over Mark 9:24 with them, where Jesus challenges the man whose boy is demonized, and the man says, "Hey, maybe I don't believe them to the level that you want me to believe, but I believe. Help me in the part of me that is not believing." And Jesus honors that, so it would be good to work through that with someone. You can pray with them to have more faith. And then finally, the one thing I'd want to add here is that we want to clarify that it's for the long run. Praying these things is not something that we want people to think that it's going to fix things in a day or two, because we don't want them to feel like their relationship with God is failing because they're anxious, or because they prayed this prayer once or twice and they don't have the faith they need right away. Praying for more faith and growing in our faith is a lifelong deal, but it sets us on the path to long-term fruitfulness. All right, so somebody mentioned scripture, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. We often point people to all the verses that tell us not to be afraid, and that is helpful for some people and not others. And I think the reason it's not helpful for some people is that they don't have the faith to internalize it deeply enough. It's one thing if we do have the faith, it's another thing if we don't. And then there's also possibly other issues going on. We don't know if the person has suffered trauma. We don't know what the person's childhood was like. We don't know the parenting style that they had, etc. So there are so many possibilities of what could be causing the anxiety. What is better is to suggest that they pray and meditate over certain scriptures on a regular basis. We could pray with them to internalize those scriptures. we need to emphasize that this is a long-term effort again, because we don't want the relationship with God to feel like a failure if that doesn't succeed in a day or two. But over the long run, praying and meditating over certain scriptures will have an impact, but it is not a short-term solution. So that's something to consider. All right, here's another one. Remember we talked a little bit about continually seeking reassurance? Well, someone who continually seeks reassurance and we're continually giving it to them, it's counterintuitive, but it's not really helpful. The problem is when we give reassurance over and over, the person knows that you can't guarantee that. You know, they know that you cannot guarantee that the thing that they're afraid of is not going to happen. Usually with anxiety, the brain of the anxious person is reacting to a very unlikely, scary outcome as if it were highly likely. So for example, the thing that they're afraid of could have maybe a 1% chance of actually happening. But their emotional brain will feel like it's got a 50% chance of happening. And they may even be aware of that difference. And they may be aware that they're blowing something out of proportion, but they can't really help it. So one of the things to do is to pray for perspective. Another thing is to be empathetic, just like someone shared earlier, to provide empathy with the initial assurance. So we do want to say, hey, you know, this is out of proportion. And we do want to say that, you know, we care and we validate their concern, their fear. We don't want to validate that what they're afraid of is real, you know, or at least not realistic. We don't want to validate that it's not real. We don't want to validate that it is realistic because it's not realistic. I'm tripping my own words here. But anyway, if they keep seeking reassurance, it could be unhealthy rumination. So we want them to try to resist that impulse to continually to seek reassurance. And if they're working with a therapist, the chances are the therapist is helping them do that. So we want to support the work that they're doing with a therapist by praying with them that the original assurance would be enough and that they resist the need to continually seek reassurance. So basically, we're praying for strength in the response prevention. And even if they're not at a place where they need to see a therapist, that's a good pattern to be aware of. All right, now here's one thing that I wish God wouldn't do, but he does do it. God sometimes uses these systematic desensitizations. Sometimes God just doesn't respect the things that we're anxious about. And he will bring about situations, and he will put us in situations that bring us face to face with the thing that we're afraid of. So for example, if somebody's afraid of public speaking and the boss asks them for a presentation to a large audience, well, you know, they could avoid it. They could just, you know, figure out an excuse or try to tap somebody else to do it or whatever. And I've seen lots of people do that kind of avoidance. Been guilty of it myself sometimes. But really, what is God up to? My feeling is that he's generally bringing healing. And so he's drawing us nearer and building faith in the process. So I've tried to learn that when opportunities like that come up, try to press into that with God and not to avoid it. So now we're going to do an exercise where you're going to think of a time when it seemed like God was asking you to do something you felt anxious about. You don't have to share here if this is, you know, if this feels too vulnerable. So I give you permission not to. But we're going to break up into groups, and you'll share what you were anxious about, if you want to, what you did, and what was the result. And as you share, the reporter needs to remember what the theme is so that we can come back. They can put it in the private chat to Christy. Ready?
All right, ready, go.
We'll give you 5 minutes.
Right, we're back. Go ahead, Nader.
All right, so as soon as you come back, whoever your reporter is, if you could summarize the theme in the private chat to Christy. Christy, do we have a feed coming in?
I bet they're typing.
Okay.
Right. There's a theme of just doing it, leaning into it, resting in God,
Mhm.
fortification in your personal identity and God's identity.
Okay.
There's a theme around like, at least we tried to do it, feeling better for that. Like that's a victory.
Mhm.
And for some people, it takes a while just to get to there.
Yeah.
And theme of like usually turns out better than it was feared to be.
Yeah, and that's usually what happens with exposure therapies is that we tend to look back and say, wow, that was not as bad as I thought it would be, because the fruit's generally worth it. So
let me interrupt real quick too, Nader. One more just came in. A theme didn't emerge other than just doing it, but there's both. Not only does it's not as bad as it seems like it would be, but also sometimes it is just bad, and it does.
It does feel bad. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the keys with exposure therapy is that to stay with the thing long enough, to stay long enough for it to recede. Sometimes what happens is we quit while the anxiety is still high, and so we don't get to experience the reduction in anxiety later on. And sometimes we're taking on too much, and hopefully God does not invite us into taking on too much. But the idea here is to be discerning. What feels too much to us, to God may say, hey, this is not too much. So, all right, anxiety redemption prayer. Let's talk a little bit about a model of prayer that I've developed dealing with anxiety. And I developed it really mostly from looking at the experience of Jesus and Paul. So the two scripture passages that this is based on is Mark 14 and 2 Corinthians 12. Both Jesus and Paul experienced situations where they faced something that they really wanted God to take away. Jesus in Gethsemane and Paul with the thorn in the flesh. There are 3 steps that they each took in the model of prayer that they exercised, and we're going to look at each of those and build the model from there. The very first thing that they both did was ask for God to take it away. Jesus asked God if there was another way. Paul asked directly that the thorn be removed from his flesh. In both situations, the answer was no. God said no. The cross was God's will for Jesus, and for Paul, we know that God told him that my grace is sufficient for you. And then the third step is they both accepted the situation. They accepted what God has for them with hope for redemption. It wasn't like the kind of acceptance that secular mindfulness talks about acceptance, like a neutral kind of acceptance. But this is an acceptance with hope. This is a positive kind of surrender. So in Hebrews 12:2, it says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul rejoices. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. So the model that we have requires theological clarity on 3 points. The first point is acceptance. The cross is unavoidable. Acceptance of the suffering that God allows in our lives is an important step in the path in our journey with God. we need to accept that there will be some suffering and that we are going to go through it with God. The second thing that we need some theological clarity on is redemption. The cross leads to resurrection power. And so we're going to talk a little bit about God's redeeming power and what that looks like. And then finally is gratitude, giving thanks in the middle of difficulty. So let's talk a little bit about each of those before we go back to the model. So acceptance. Following Jesus includes carrying our cross and following him. That's a given. I doubt I have to convince you of that. I doubt I have to look up all the passages for the cost of discipleship, etc. You guys all know this. But one thing that's not talked about often is that resisting the cross creates spiritual and psychological tension. Spiritually, it gets in the way of our relationship with God. Psychologically, it creates anxiety. A lot of anxiety comes from efforts to avoid all suffering or a particular kind of suffering. Mindfulness therapies in particular focus on a kind of a radical acceptance, they call it, of things that are anxiety producing. And that reduces the anxiety. Let's talk a little bit about redemption power. I find that a lot of times our understanding of God's redemption is too narrow. Here are some true but insufficient views, in my opinion. First, we believe that God is going to bring something good out of it. Well, yeah, that is true. He will bring something good. But that's not specific enough for me. I can minister to someone going through something similar in the future. So, if somebody's spouse leaves them, they feel like they can be there for somebody else who's, going through a similar betrayal. Well, yes, that's true, but it's not necessarily the only way that we have redemption. God is strengthening my character. Same thing. Very true, but there's more. So, Paul talks about sharing in the sufferings of Christ. But he also goes on to say that he gets to share in the resurrection of Christ as a result. Jesus' resurrection had redemptive power in bringing forth more of the kingdom of God. And sharing in the sufferings of Christ also means we share in the redemptive power of his resurrection. So if we say this another way, my suffering not only teaches me to become more kind, patient, loving like Christ, it also gives me more of Christ's power to bless others through my ministry. It increases the effectiveness of my ministry. Do you notice that people in ministry who have suffered have a more powerful impact on you spiritually? I know it's true for me. In fact, the person who was like the most meaningful to me when I was going through suffering was somebody named Elizabeth Elliot. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot went as missionaries among the Auca tribe in Ecuador in the 1950s. Jim and a few other men that were with him were killed by the Aucas. They speared them. And of course, Elizabeth, his widow, I think she had a daughter at the time, and she left for a while, but then she came back, and she went back to the people that killed her husband. And the tribe ended up coming to Christ. Elizabeth's suffering was redeemed by God in that the fruitfulness of her ministry was multiplied. And not only was it multiplied there, even later on in life, when she came back to the US and she had a ministry here, even though I don't agree with everything that she stands for theologically, everything that she says, but nonetheless, she really spoke to me. God used her to really speak to me through her books and through her speaking and so on about suffering well with God. And so we see that her suffering went beyond just being able to be there for other widows, but also to other people in general, and to being a vessel for God to use her in their lives. Let's look specifically at what the Bible says about that. 2 Corinthians 1, Paul talks about the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort and we can be a comfort for those let me read it. So that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. Let's step forward a few chapters He once again gets back to the theme. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Now I get, folks often, I'm sure you hear this from students, and I'm sure you guys know how to answer that, but a lot of students will say, well, Paul talks about the suffering that he endured as persecution, and my suffering is not persecution. It does use that. And the answer, I think, is in Romans 8:28 and 29. And we know that in all things, not just persecution, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And what is his purpose? That we be conformed to the image of his son. And the image of his son, we know, carries also the power of his resurrection. So our suffering is not wasted. God has a missional fruit as a result of it in store for us. And so I want us to think a little bit about that redemption as we look at the model of prayer a little bit later. The final thing that we need to look at is gratitude and difficulty. So since we know that God is going to redeem whatever it is that's difficult, we can be grateful for that redemption. We can express gratitude for how he is redeeming it. In some traditions, some church traditions, people express gratitude for the difficult thing itself. I don't feel like I can go that far. But I do know that God is redeeming it. And I certainly feel very theologically sound standing on that truth. And so when Paul says in Philippians 4:6, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. I'm all there, right? I can be thankful for the redemption that God is doing. So let's go back to the model then. The model that presented to us by Jesus and Paul, how anxiety redemption prayer works. First, we pray for God to fix the problem. Jesus' first response to most people who came to him was to heal them. So I feel very confident that we are invited to pray for God to fix the problem as a first step. Second, we can express gratitude for how he is redeeming it. And that has two benefits. Psychologically, it brings calm. Spiritually, it builds faith. And then we can actually reinforce that faith by praying for how he is redeeming something. Even though we don't know how, say, God, I just pray that you continue to redeem it. And then that calm and that faith that is generated at this point enables us then to come to acceptance. And if it's not enough, then we can pray for the strength and courage to accept what's going on. So let me give you a quick example. Last winter, I had a physical, and I got an email from my doctor. It said, hey, one of your lab results is a little bit off. I'm sending you to a specialist. And needless to say, I was a little bit anxious. And I did what, most people do. I Googled it, and I got some reassurance. Okay, it's probably not a big deal. But then I did the very thing I said not to do a few slides earlier, which I kept checking. A day later, I went back and I checked some more, and then I checked some more. And then the more I checked, the more anxious I got, which is exactly what I shouldn't have been doing, right? There's a line in the sand, and sometimes it helps to ask somebody who's not anxious about the same thing to say, hey, when is it reasonable for me to stop? Because continually checking beyond that point will increase the anxiety. So, all right, so here's how I prayed. I pray, Lord, that as much suffering as can be taken from me within your will here, that you would take it from me. I don't want to have pain in biopsies, surgeries, or chemo. Please make the next result normal. Lord, I acknowledge that you're at work to redeem this somehow, even though I don't know how. I have faith that you are redeeming it, and thank you. Father, I pray for the fullness of what you're doing. See, now I'm reinforcing that faith. I pray for the fullness of what you're doing. Whatever good you are bringing about in my life for my sake and for the sake of others, I pray for it. Lord, I accept the suffering you have not and will not take away. And I accept the suffering of not knowing at this point what you will or will not be taken away, or how you're using it all for good. Give me the strength and courage I need. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the chance to do that. I'm going to give you about 1 to 2 minutes to identify something difficult or anxiety provoking for you, Pray for God to remedy that situation. Thank him ahead of time for how he is redeeming it, how he's working on it, even if the answer we want is not given immediately and may not be. Pray for that redemption, and then pray for strength and courage to accept that particular cross. One thing I want to clarify, if you're having trouble identifying something because the anxiety is too general, keep picking at it. Keep pulling at what is it exactly that's making me anxious until you get to something specific. Because doing it as something that you can't put words around, it's going to be hard to do the exercise. So you might want to just pull at it until you get to something pretty specific. So we'll give you about 1.5 minutes to do this, and then we'll move to the exercise. We'll move you into the groups. So as you go into your breakout groups, the question is, what was this prayer time like for you? Christy, take us away into the breakout groups. We're going to actually talk as a group here. The group is small enough. So one of the things I was considering and just discussing it with Christy, I think rather than go into a lot more content at this point, I'm going to just give us a chance to talk through any questions you might have, talk through how the prayer model worked for you or didn't work, and any obstacles that you may face with it. Just give us a little bit more, the luxury of a few more minutes of Q&A, because I'm realizing that the rest of the content that I had, even though when I timed it before, it did fit roughly, it looks like we're going to be quite a bit over time. So I'm not going to go into the trauma piece. I'm not going to go into the, what do you call it, the mindfulness piece. So we'll just stay with the model that I just gave. So tell me, how was praying the prayer? What was praying the prayer like for you? And we'll also open it up to general Q&A.
I really like the model. I mean, it's really hard to get there in 90 seconds or something, but the model was so good. I think because it asks us to, what I like about it is at the bottom, it asks us to accept our current situation as opposed to fighting against it, which I tend to do a lot of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is our natural response, right? Who wants to suffer? You know, I mean, and unfortunately what that does is, you know, it creates the problems I mentioned earlier, is that it raises anxiety and it gets in the way of our relationship with God. But it's a shift, you know, that requires grace, and that's how we press into God and ask for it, and ask for the grace to do that.
I guess, Nita, my question is, I mean, with this particular student, they would need to be obviously open to doing this, and we need some time one-on-one or Zoom or whatever we do right now on the phone one-on-one to go through it, right? I mean, when you go through it with people, it takes a little while, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it takes some troubleshooting sometimes. It's not easy, especially for people who are, you know, starting out with it. I mean, you guys are all seasoned, but you know, it takes a couple of rounds and some troubleshooting. I think the bottom line is, like you said, is that final acceptance, right? Is that, okay, well, you know, I signed up for Jesus. I signed up to follow him. I asked him to take it away. He didn't. So, you know what other choice is there right now? You know, I'm not going to walk away. I need to embrace this. This is what God has chosen. He is redeeming it. So I'm going to trust his path, and I'm going to just embrace that cross and move on. You know, press into him with it.
Good, thank you.
Any other thoughts about the prayer or about in general, questions in general about pastoring people through anxiety?
I have one thing that I didn't get a chance to share, but I'll try to be brief. But that is, my spiritual director actually told me about anxiety that I was dealing with. It had to do with work, and he said, well, why are you doing it alone? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're participating with Christ here. You are equally yoked to Christ. And where does your burden go? It should be with Christ. So you should share that together, and it's actually his burden. And you say, Lord, what are we going to do about this situation?
Yeah.
Rather than take it on myself.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really helpful. It was wisdom I imparted.
That's really helpful to me too, Gary. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. It's good to remember that. Also, it's hard to do that if we don't accept the cross, right? If I'm fighting against it, then it's hard for me to carry it with Jesus, right? Any other thoughts or questions?
I think for me, the prayer time, even just the moment where I have to your word about don't let it just be kind of like, Jesus, I'm worried, please help me because, but like my anxiety is what? Like what's the specific, going down the path. It took me almost the whole time even just to go down that path.
Yeah.
But how it was freeing actually to be able to name the one thing and then to pray about it that way.
Absolutely.
And my question would be, what would you call this? Like, let's say I'm with a student, they're worried about something and would you call this like, I'm helping you learn a different way to pray about it? Or I'm just trying to figure out like, what's the thing I'm doing? Because it's not just that I want to help them learn how to pray this way.
Yeah. I call it the ARP, the Anxiety Redemption Prayer.
Okay. So you just,
I just baptized it the ARP. So I started out calling it the TARP, the Anxiety Redemption Prayer. But then, my wife is like, Al, it could be other anxiety redemption prayers. You can't just claim the corner on it. So it's like, okay, I'll just go with the ARP, Anxiety Redemption Prayer. That's what I call it. I'm waiting for a better name, but that's, yeah. But I want to go back to the thing you said, Christy, about getting to the thing you're anxious about. Very often that's the case. And very often in therapy, that's we end up trying to help people to just get to what is it exactly that you're anxious about. And then when you finally get to it, it's not so bad, right? When you finally get to it, and I think from a spiritual perspective, Satan likes to keep it kind of like, amorphous and, general, because it's hard to deal with. Right. And he likes the darkness, he likes it to stay in darkness. But let's just get into the light. What is it exactly? Right. And when I have it named and I have some words around it, then I can pray this way about it, and then I can experience some freedom and some surrender and some hope for redemption. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, is it a good time to stop? All right. Well, blessings, everyone. Feel free to email me if you have any thoughts.
Thank you so much, Peter. I don't know if you would let us, with your copyright on there or whatever, have the notes, but these are great.
Yeah, I'll definitely, I'll be making the PowerPoint available.